There was one piece of advice Victorian mothers whispered to their daughters on their wedding night that would make most modern women walk out of the room. And the truly disturbing part. It worked exactly as intended. I'm not talking about some quaint reminder about proper etiquette or how to arrange flowers. This was a calculated instruction designed to break a woman's spirit before she even understood what was happening to her. And when you hear what it was, you'll realize why an entire generation of women lived and died without ever questioning their own misery. Close the door. This gets dark. The advice was simple, brutal, and repeated in drawing rooms across England, Europe, and America for decades. Mothers would look their daughters in the eye, these young women about to marry, and say, "Lie back and think of England." Or in America, "Close your eyes and think of the flag." The French had their own version. The Germans too. Every culture that valued female obedience had a variation of this same poison. But here's what makes this truly cruel. It wasn't just about sex. That's what everyone thinks when they first hear it. Oh, how sad Victorian women didn't enjoy intimacy. But that completely misses the point. This advice was doing something far more insidious. It was teaching women that their bodies didn't belong to them, that their feelings were irrelevant, that discomfort, pain, violation, all of it was the price of being a good woman. Patriotic woman. A woman who mattered. Think about the psychology of that for a moment. You're 17, maybe 19 years old. You've been told your entire life that marriage is your purpose, your salvation, your only path to respect. And then, right before the biggest transition of your life, your own mother, the person who supposedly loves you most in this world, looks at you and says, "What's about to happen to you doesn't matter. You don't matter. Your job is to endure." The genius of it, if we can call something this dark genius, was that it came from mothers, not from men, not from priests or doctors or lawmakers, from the women who had survived it. That's how you make oppression stick. You make the oppressed enforce it on each other. You make mothers look at their daughters with love and compassion and still hand them the same chains they wore. And it worked because it was framed as wisdom, as protection. I'm telling you this because I love you, because I don't want you to be disappointed, because this is just how the world works, darling. The cruelty dressed up as care. That's what makes it so hard to fight. When your oppressor hugs you and calls it help. Let me take you back to 1857. London. A woman named Frances Power Cobbe is sitting in a parlor, listening to her friend describe her marriage. The friend is 22. She's been married 8 months. And she's explaining very calmly how she's learned to leave her body during certain moments, how she floats near the ceiling and thinks about her garden, about hymns from church, about anything except what's happening below. Frances is horrified. But here's what stops her cold. Every other woman in that room is nodding. They all have their techniques. One recites poetry in her head. Another does mathematical calculations. A third plans menus for dinner parties that will never happen. They've all built elaborate mental escape routes from their own lives. And they talk about it the way you might discuss a recipe for soup. This is what "lie back and think of England" actually meant in practice. It was a survival manual, a guide to dissociation, a way to teach women to abandon their own bodies because their bodies had become prisons. And the worst part, they didn't even recognize it as trauma. They thought it was maturity, sophistication, the mark of a lady who understood her duty. The medical establishment backed this up with enthusiasm. Doctors in the 1800s genuinely believed that respectable women didn't experience sexual desire, that if a woman claimed to enjoy intimacy, she was either lying or mentally ill. There were actual diagnoses for this: nymphomania, hysteria, female deviancy. Women were institutionalized for admitting they felt pleasure. Pleasure was pathologized. Pain was prescribed. Dr. William Acton, one of the most influential physicians of the Victorian era, wrote in his textbook that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feelings of any kind. Happily for them. He genuinely believed that female desire was a burden to be pitted. And this wasn't some fringe opinion. This was taught in medical schools. This was the scientific consensus. So when mothers told their daughters to think of England, they were passing on what they believed was medical fact. They were protecting their daughters from the shame of wanting something they shouldn't want, from the danger of expecting something they'd never receive. It was preventive disappointment, preemptive grief. But here's where it gets even darker. This advice didn't just shape private lives, shaped law, politics, the entire social order. Because if women could be trained to accept violation as duty, what else could they be trained to accept? The answer, almost anything. Women couldn't own property because they'd been trained not to want autonomy. They couldn't vote because they'd been trained to see their opinions as irrelevant. They couldn't leave abusive marriages because they'd been trained to see suffering as virtue. Every legal restriction on women's rights existed because of a foundation of psychological conditioning that started on wedding nights with those 7 words. Lie back and think of England. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made it nearly impossible for women to divorce. A man could divorce his wife for adultery. But a woman, she had to prove adultery plus incest, bigamy, cruelty, or desertion. Because the assumption was that a woman's suffering in marriage was normal, expected, part of the contract. The law literally reflected the same logic as that wedding night advice. Your pain doesn't count. Endure. And women internalized this so deeply that they defended it. When the suffragettes started fighting for the vote, some of their loudest opponents were other women. Well-dressed, educated women who genuinely believed that female political participation would destroy society. Why? Because they'd been so thoroughly conditioned to believe their own perspective was worthless that they thought giving women power was dangerous. There's a letter from 1889, written by a woman named Mrs. Humphrey Ward, arguing against female suffrage. She wrote, "Women's minds are not suited to the rough and tumble of political life." And then she added, almost proudly, "We are too sensitive, too emotional, too easily overwhelmed." She's describing the exact psychological damage caused by generations of lie back and think of England, and she's calling it natural female essence. The victim defending the knife. Now let me tell you about Josephine Butler, because her story shows you what happened when women stopped thinking of England and started thinking of themselves. Josephine was born into privilege in 1828. Educated, married to a supportive man, everything that was supposed to make a Victorian woman happy. But in 1863, her daughter fell from a banister and died. And something in Josephine broke. Not just from grief, though that was real, but from the sudden clarity that came with it. She looked at her life, at all the rules she'd followed, and thought, what is any of this for? She started visiting workhouses, places where poor women were essentially imprisoned for being poor. And she met women who'd been locked up for prostitution while the men who'd bought them walked free. She met 13-year-old girls who'd been trafficked and then arrested for their own exploitation. And she realized that lie back and think of England wasn't just wedding night advice. It was the foundation of an entire system that treated female bodies as national resources to be used and discarded. So Josephine did something radical. She got angry. Publicly angry. She started giving speeches about the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws that allowed police to force any woman suspected of prostitution to undergo invasive medical examinations. Meanwhile, the men who visited prostitutes faced no consequences. The laws literally embodied the wedding night advice. Women's bodies were sites of duty and inspection. Men's were free. Josephine was called a whore for talking about this publicly. A disgrace to her gender. Other women, good Christian women, crossed the street to avoid her. Her mail was full of death threats. And for years she made no progress. The laws stayed on the books. The system didn't budge. Because it wasn't just laws she was fighting. It was that internalized voice in every woman's head saying, "This is just how things are. Don't make a fuss. Think of England." But then something shifted. Other women started listening. Started recognizing their own experiences in Josephine's words. Started realizing that the private shame they'd been taught to swallow was actually a public injustice they could fight. And slowly, painfully, over years of organizing, the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed. Not because men suddenly became enlightened, but because women stopped accepting that their suffering was the price of civilization. Here's what haunts me about this history. We act like it's over. Like lie back and think of England is just a funny old phrase that means nothing now. But is it? How many women still fake orgasms because they've been taught that male satisfaction is more important than their own truth? How many girls still grow up learning that their value lies in being pleasant, agreeable, not too much trouble? How many times have you heard someone describe a woman as difficult or demanding just for stating what she wants? The phrase changed. The psychology didn't. We don't tell women to think of England anymore. Now we tell them to be cool. To not be that girl who makes things awkward by having boundaries. To swipe right and hook up and pretend emotional investment is weakness. We've rebranded female dissociation as empowerment. That's not progress. That's just a different flag to stare at while you abandon your own body. And before you think this is just about sex, let me remind you. The Victorian advice wasn't really about sex either. It was about training women to override their own instincts, to distrust their own reactions, to see their discomfort as the problem rather than the situation causing it. We still do that. Every time a woman says, "He made me uncomfortable," and someone responds with, "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" That's the same mechanism. Think of England. Don't trust yourself. The cruel brilliance of that Victorian advice was that it short-circuited women's ability to even recognize abuse. If you're taught from your wedding night that violation is duty, how do you later identify when duty becomes violence? You can't. The categories collapse. That's why so many Victorian women stayed in marriages that were slowly killing them. They literally couldn't see what was happening because they'd been trained to interpret their own suffering as virtue. And we're still doing it. We just call it different things now. Girl boss culture, that tells women to work themselves to death and call it ambition. Wellness, that medicalizes normal female emotions as problems requiring expensive solutions. Sex positivity, that pressures women to perform enthusiasm they don't feel. All of it is just new wallpaper on the same old room. A room where women's authentic experiences are somehow always the problem. So what's the answer? How do we break a pattern that's been running for centuries? We start by saying the thing Victorian women weren't allowed to say. This hurts. I don't like this. I want something different. Those simple sentences are revolutionary because they require believing that your inner experience matters more than external expectations. That your comfort is worth defending. That you are not a resource for the nation, the family, the market, or anyone else to use up. We stop performing gratitude for things that harm us. Stop calling endurance strength when it's really just survival. Stop teaching girls to manage other people's feelings at the expense of their own. And most importantly, we stop passing on the poison. We break the chain of mothers telling daughters that suffering is sophistication. That silence is love. That disappearing from your own life is what good women do. Because here's the truth those Victorian mothers never got to tell their daughters. You are allowed to be present in your own body. You are allowed to want things and name them. You are allowed to walk away from any situation, any person, any system that requires you to think of England instead of yourself. That's not selfishness. That's survival. Real survival, not the dissociative kind. The cruelest advice was also the truest in one sense. It revealed exactly how the system worked. How power maintains itself through the small, intimate moments of breaking someone's will. How oppression is often delivered by people who love you, which is why it's so hard to see. But truth can cut two ways. Once you see the mechanism, you can choose to stop participating in it. You can be the mother who tells her daughter something different. The friend who refuses to nod along. The woman who stops floating near the ceiling and plants her feet on the ground. You can be the one who thinks of yourself instead. And maybe, just maybe, that's how empires actually fall. Not through dramatic revolution, but through millions of small refusals. Women deciding their bodies are not territories. That their lives are not flags. That they're done performing patriotism for systems that were never built to love them back. So here's my question for you. What are you still enduring that you've been taught to call duty? What are you still thinking of England through? And more importantly, what would happen if you stopped? I don't have the answer for you. Nobody does. But I know this. The first step is always the same. It's noticing, seeing the pattern, recognizing that voice in your head telling you to be quiet, be good, don't make trouble for what it really is. Not wisdom, not love. Just the ghost of someone else's fear dressed up as your own common sense. And then you get to decide. Keep thinking of England or start thinking of yourself. The Victorians might have called that selfish. Call it waking up.